Welcome back everyone. We've covered every other Revenant spec, so now it is time to cover what is undoubtedly the most fun of all of them, Power Vindicator, whose entire purpose is to crush your enemies beneath your muscly calves.
Woo! Superhero landing! Yeah, that's really hard on your knees.
Power Vindicator is the single best DPS spec that Revenant has access to, and we've been building to this one for a while now. Vindicator is simple to play, has outstanding damage, lets you nuke your enemies from orbit with the single most powerful dodge in the game, has blocks and evades on every weapon set that you're going to be using, and with a few slight tweaks, lets you run around with basically infinite endurance in open world, pinging from mob to mob, growing your fortune with every dodge. Revenant has been my main class for years, so it is time, my friends, to finally cover what is its single greatest damage build. Let's dive in. So quickly, what is Vindicator? Vindicator is the Revenant specialization that came out with End of Dragons, which gives you access to Greatsword, and it replaces your dodge with 3 different powerful variants depending on what Grandmaster trait you pick. You also get access to the new Alliance stance, which you can toggle between your offensive Arkamora skills and your defensive St. Victor skills. You also get access to the new skill Energy Meld, which by default will simply gain you some extra endurance, but we can buff this further with traits. Vindicator is one of the highest bursting power damage builds in the game, which makes this exceptionally fun to play. To quickly cover off on our traits, in Devastation, Unsuspecting Strikes, Notoriety, and Swift Termination are all there to load you up with extra strike damage modifiers, the main thing that you're looking for on a DPS build. In Invocation, Rising Tide will grant you extra damage when you're above 75% health. Spirit Boon will grant you and your allies some extra boons whenever you swap legends, notably Might when you swap to Shiro and Vigor when you swap to Alliance stance. The Vigor here is really nice because it increases your endurance recovery so you can dodge even more often. Roiling Mist is one of the most important traits on all Power Revenant builds. This makes it so that you get an extra 25% critical chance from Fury, which you need to reach 100% crit chance, which is an incredibly important thing on power damage builds. Vindicator makes it so that your dodge now causes you to leap in the air and land on your enemies for a huge burst of damage. The effects of your dodge change depending on the final trait that you pick, but for here, we'll basically always take Death Drop, which causes our dodge to inflict extra damage. Leviathan Strength gives us an extra 10% damage whenever our endurance is not full. One of the trickiest parts about playing Vindicator is keeping your endurance from filling up, so you'll be dodging as part of your damage rotation. Reaver's Curse will reduce the cooldown of your Energy Meld while increasing the effectiveness of your next dodge after you use it. In this case, it will double the damage of your next dodge. Death Drop will seriously amp up the damage that your dodge does. It will also grant you the buff Forerunner of Death, which will grant you an extra 25% damage for the next 10 seconds. This means that your entire rotation becomes centered around dodging to keep up this Forerunner of Death buff, as well as keeping your endurance from being full to make sure you're always triggering Leviathan Strength. For your gear, you're simply going to run Berserker's gear with Rune of the Dragon Hunter. If you want to optimize things slightly, you can also run a Dragon's back piece, so you trade some of the extra precision that you don't actually need for extra ferocity. This is a small gain though, so Berserkers is totally fine. Your default loadout is going to be running Sword with Greatsword with Sigils of Force and Air on each weapon set. With a few sigil tweaks, we can make this build absolutely pop off in open world, so stay tuned. Sword is your highest damaging weapon set, and the fast attacks pair perfectly with the Impossible Odd skill in the Shiro Legend, which will cause your attacks to deal a small follow-up strike. So faster attacks equal more damage. Greatsword gives you access to more AoE damage than Sword and scales really well the larger your target's hitbox is. This is due to the incredible Eternity's Requiem skill, which lays down a huge burst of damage in an AoE around you. Sometimes it is a good idea to swap out one of your weapons for Staff for the insane CC damage it brings. Usually you'll want to swap out Greatsword to keep the impeccable damage from Sword, but if you're a Greatsword enjoyer, you can replace swords as well. For our relic, we'll simply be taking Relic of the Thief, which will give us an extra damage modifier as we use our weapon skills. For food, take the best power and ferocity food you have on hand. Ideally, this will be your Ascended sous vide steaks with sweet and spicy butternut squash being the regular alternative. For your utility, take Superior Sharpening Stones. The potent versions of these last an hour and align perfectly with your Ascended food buff. Plus, they're the best value you can get here. For the legends you'll be taking, you'll usually be using Shiro and Alliance stance. Shiro is your peak legend for damage entirely due to the skill Impossible Odds. As soon as you enter Shiro, you'll activate it, leave it on, and profit. Impossible Odds will cause your attacks to deal a small follow-up attack, which significantly ups your damage. You do have a nice stun break on Riposting Shadows. Phase Traversal will port you to your target, and Jade Winds is some nice CC. All of these skills though are rather expensive in terms of energy, so only use them if you have energy to spare. Alliance Stance is the new toy that Vindicator gets to play with and actually gives you access to 10 skills instead of the usual 5. Toggle your F3 skill, Alliance Tactics, and you can swap between the offensive Archimedes and the defensive St. Victor skills. Due to you simply being a DPS, you're basically never going to swap off Archimedes. On Archimedes, your heal skill, Selfish Spirit, will damage nearby enemies, inflict vulnerability, and grant you might. Scavenger Burst is a targeted AoE which deals damage, inflicts burning, as well as granting you endurance, quickness, and fury for each target you hit. An incredibly useful skill in open world to help you maintain buffs on yourself. Reaver's Rage is a personal stun break which also grants you stability. It'll also damage and stun nearby targets. Nomad's Advance will cause you to leap forward, damage foes, and grant yourself might. A very nice skill for mobility and helps you stick to your target. Spear of Archimedes is the main skill that you'll be using while you're in Alliance stance, at least in your main damage rotation. You'll summon an NPC to hurl a spear at your target, inflicting a huge burst of damage after a short delay. Although you rarely dip into St. Victor stance, there are some useful skills to be aware of. Awakening will break stun on nearby allies as well as granting them protection and stability. Tree Song will grant regeneration, cleanse conditions, and heal allies for each condition removed. It's also very nice to use this on yourself to cleanse conditions and get out of combat faster. If you need to provide stability to your team, then you can swap out Alliance Stance for Jalis. Jalis gives you access to Inspiring Reinforcement, which places down a yellow brick road to give your team stability. You also get Vengeful Hammers as an upkeep skill, which is a decent DPS increase. Outside that, you also have Forced Engagement to taunt enemies and provide some soft CC, as well as Rite of the Great Dwarf, which will stun break your allies and give them a 50% damage reduction for a couple seconds. An expensive but very handy skill. Now, with access to all this profound knowledge, it's time to touch on our rotation. Your rotation basically consists of your opener, your Shiro loop, and then your Alliance loop. Stitch them together and you are good to go. For our opener, start with Energy Meld to increase the effectiveness of our dodge. Use Spear of Archimedes, dodge to get your Forerunner of Death damage modifier. Use Greatsword 3 into Greatsword 5, Greatsword 2, Legend and Weapon Swap. From here, we'll fall into our Shiro loop. Use Sword 2 and activate Impossible Odds, then use Sword 4 and Sword 5. You'll then dodge, auto attack until Sword 2 is off cooldown, Sword 2, auto attack again while waiting for Sword 2 to once again come off cooldown. You'll then dodge and Sword 2 again. We'll then Legend and Weapon Swap to go into Alliance stance. Before we touch on your Alliance and Greatsword loop, there are a few things that we need to chat about. Because Alliance stance won't make use of an upkeep skill like Impossible Odds, you have much more energy to play with. So you're going to want to use Energy Meld twice while you're in Alliance stance. This will amp up your dodges and grant you some extra endurance. So you'll use Energy Meld here ideally. You'll start with Greatsword 2, Spear of Archimedes, Greatsword 5, use Energy Meld, Greatsword 3, and Greatsword 2, you'll then dodge. We'll do one auto attack chain to wait for Greatsword 2, Greatsword 2 again, one auto attack chain, you'll dodge, then Greatsword 2, one auto attack chain, we'll then Energy Meld, Spear of Archimedes, dodge once again, Greatsword 3, Greatsword 2, we'll finish up with Greatsword 5, you'll then Legend and Weapon Swap, and go back to your Shiro loop, rinse and repeat. In actual encounters, you're going to need to adapt your rotation depending on how much endurance you have. In some cases, team members will grant you extra endurance, which may mean you'll lose your damage modifier from Leviathan Strength. In this case, just squeeze in an extra dodge whenever you can. And also, depending on your team composition, you may find yourself short of vigor, and hence short on endurance. If this is the case, skip either Sword 4 or 5 in Shiro and use Energy Meld instead. If you're in Alliance stance, replace a dodge with an auto attack chain as needed. For some general rules of thumb to help you remember the rotation: try and dodge every 5 seconds to stop your endurance from filling up. Use Sword 2 3 times while you're in Shiro, and use Sword 4 and 5 once each. Pair up your dodges with Greatsword and Sword 2. Your best skills while on Greatsword and in Alliance stance are Greatsword 2, Greatsword 3, Greatsword 5, Spear of Archimedes, and Energy Meld. So you'll use all these skills when you enter Alliance stance and just before you leave. Because you're using your dodge as part of your damage rotation, make sure to use Greatsword 4 and Sword 3 to block and dodge attacks respectively. Practice using these skills to avoid damage instead. If you want to replace either Sword or Greatsword with Star for the extra damage, just use all your good skills off cooldown, dodge every few seconds, and profit. If you need to replace a legend for stability, swap out Alliance stance for Jealous. The same idea applies as before. Keep Impossible Odds and Vengeful Hammers up as much as possible and use your good skills off cooldown. Now for an open world build bonus round. What makes Vindicator, in my opinion, the single most fun build for open world is the unhinged things you can pull off with a single sigil swap. Grab yourself a second greatsword and sword. Exotic is totally fine as well, and throw on a sigil of stamina. This will refill your endurance whenever you kill an enemy. Given how insanely bursty this build is, you'll be doing this all the time. Against anything lower than a champion, you'll more or less be able to infinitely dodge and completely annihilate anything in your path while being untouchable at the same time. Combine this with the insane mobility you have from Phase Traversal, Nomad's Advance, Greatsword 3, and Sword 5, you'll be moving between enemies in the blink of an eye, playing whack-a-mole. And that, my friends, is everything you need to know to master what I believe is the single most fun DPS build in the game. It has everything you need. It has huge burst damage, blocks and evades built in for free. It has the flexibility to swap around your weapons and legends as you see fit, all while being incredibly durable and simple to play. I didn't even mention how you can take this build, swap a trait line around, and have access to the single greatest boon provider in the game, Power Quickness Herald. So go check out our previous video to add yet another build to your arsenal. And with that, I'll catch you all next time. Cheers.